Ancient history. We are today looking at lesson 10, the Sargonic dynasty of Akkad. It is interesting that, later on we're going to briefly touch on another dynasty from a Sargon II's dynasty in Old Babylon. The Old Babylonian Empire is referred to as the Sargonid, with a D instead of a C, dynasty. Sargon II is probably not related to Sargon I, probably took the name because it sounds cool to say you're like the great Sargon. But they're actually not related. In a previous lesson, last Monday, we looked at the rise of Sargon the Great and the kingdom of Akkad that grew out of the city-state of Kish, and he built the city of Akkad, made it his capital, and ruled over an empire that was ever expanding in his life. Today, we are going to talk about his offspring. That's Sargon the Great, the world's first emperor. And by the way, we don't know exactly what he looked like, but from the busts and the inscriptions and the images, that's the best we can do. He was the world's first emperor and the world's first dynastic emperor, meaning that his offspring, his descendants, ruled after him, which is pretty cool. After all, why build an empire if you can't give it to your kids? Sargon took the small region of Sumer that had pretty much existed as a loose federation of independent city-states since the time shortly after the flood when Eridu was repopulated and Ur and Akkad, Uruk. And during that time, different kings in different cities would be prominent, meaning they might be the leading city. There might even be those who were, ruling over other city-states or most of the region of Sumer. But Sumer is pretty much one ethnic group, one national identity within this area, which the Bible calls Shinar, which historians refer to now as Sumer. But Akkad is different because the Akkadians were the first ones who went outside of this area and conquered Assyria, Subartu, and even all the way up into what we would call Asia Minor and across the sea into Cyprus. They went down as far as Elam, and they were literally expanding the border in 3 stages like it had never been expanded before. Most of that was done during the life of Sargon, but those who came after him had to go back and reclaim some of the territories due to uprisings. And whereas it's not really sure if Sargon ever really conquered this area of Asia Minor or Turkey, or did he only campaign for it, take spoils, but never actually held it. Same with Cyprus. But we know that it was held later during the time of his descendants. So here's the family tree of Sargon. Okay. Father, Laibum. Sargon, sometimes called Tashlotum. Sargon reigned for 56 years. That's pretty impressive, right? I mean, how many of you could imagine having the same job for 56 years? It's a pretty impressive reign. you might be intrigued to find out that two of his sons died not only of natural causes, but they died of the most natural cause for an emperor. Does anyone know what that is? Can't hear you, Lauren. Yes, it is. They, you can't say they didn't die of natural causes because there is no more natural cause of death for an emperor than assassination. At least that's what history seems to imply. Yes, right. Ramush and Minishtu were both sons of Sargon, and they both died by assassination. Um, Naram Sin, it appears, died of other natural causes. So we're gonna dive into each of these. But here's how the breakdown works. Sargon actually had 5 children. Ramush, actually Ramush is not even the firstborn. Manishtu is the firstborn. Then Ramush, Ibarum, who gave birth to Ali Ahum, and Abaish Takai, Takal, and in Hedwana, and in Hedwana was the one that we talked about last week, that she was the daughter of Sargon, who he installed as the high priestess of Sin at Ur. Sin is actually the name of a Mesopotamian god, actually goddess. It's one of the names that is attributed to the very goddess whose priestess gave birth to Sargon, according to his legend. So he installed his daughter as the high priestess over the worship of the cult that his mother was a priestess of. Manishtu then gave birth to Naram Singh and Meshalim. And Naram Singh reigned for 56 years like his grandfather after his father had died. Naram Sin gave birth to Sharkali Shari, also known as Tuta Shar Ibish, Lipit Ili, the governor of Marad, Ukin Ulmash, I missed Nabi Ulmash, governor of Tutu, Lipush Jaum, who wrote the Lamentation Singer for Sin. He was the singer who wrote that song. Ukin Ulmash, and Menana Hai, the priestess of Sin at Ur. And so he followed in Sargon's footsteps and made one of his daughters the high priestess of Sin at Ur. Simat Ulmash and Shumshani, who was another of his daughters who became the priestess of Shamash at Saipar, and Tutar Napshum, another daughter who became the high priestess of Enlil at Nippur. Okay? But Sharkali Shari was the one who reigned after him for 25 years, and he was the father, Dudu. He was the father of Dudu. Go ahead, let those jokes play through your head. And he reigned 21 years. He was followed by Shudarul, who reigned for 15 years, and then the Akkadian dynasty fell. Okay? So we're going to take a few minutes to talk about each of these kings: Ramush, Manishtu, Naram Sin, Sharakali Shari, Dudu, and Shudarul. So think about this. You have a dynasty that lasts from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. 7 kings, but 6 generations, because the second two were brothers. Okay? So let's talk about Ramush. Ramush, the son of Sargon of Akkad, who reigned for only 9 years. He was the second-born son of Sargon the Great. It is not known why Sargon chose him over his older brother to be his heir and successor. All we know is it happened. Immediately, he faced rebellions from the other city-states his father conquered. And he quells the revolt. He had to reconquer Ur, where Abram was from. He had to reconquer Kasalu. He had to reconquer Lagash. He had to reconquer Der Adab. And he had to reconquer Umma. He continued the campaigns of his father in the northwest. He was a great builder. He was also despised by his people, his nobles, and especially by his family. That's interesting, isn't it? To be despised even by his own family. Going back to our map for just a moment, Ur, Kasalu, Lagash, Der Adab, and Umma. What's interesting to me about that is that these are not very far away from Akkad, right? I mean, Ur is down here, just a very short distance from the Persian Gulf along the Euphrates River, right? There's Umma, closer to the Tigris, but in between the two rivers. You know, these are, Lagash is also one of these Akkadian cities, right? One of these Sumerian cities. So why is he having to reconquer these nearby city-states? Well, for hundreds of years, the city-states of Sumer seem to enjoy their autonomy within their own city and in the surrounding villages, of course, and countryside. They were not used to the idea of kings being subject to a greater king. So when Sargon died, the assumption then was made, well, with him gone, now's a good time to rebel while the new king is still getting his feet on the ground and his backside on the throne and getting used to the crown weighing heavy on his brow. He also continued the campaigns of his father in the northwest. Now, when we go back to our map, the northwest obviously refers to all of this area here that is not quite orange, but is kind of orange pinstriped. So he continued into the region of Subartu. He continued into the area that we think of today as Syria. He continued up into Carchemish, and he continued all the way up into the land that we would today refer to as Asia Minor, okay, by the Taurus Mountains. That's interesting because you notice at this point, the Hittites are far north. But around this time, or shortly after this time, the Hittites begin migrating south, and you'll see Hittite settlements all the way down in the area of the Canaanites along the Gaza Strip by the time of Abraham, which may have been as much as 3 centuries later, or it may have been an overlapping period, depending on whose timeline you're looking at. But he came to the door of the Hittites, which I think is interesting because we had forgotten largely the Hittites from a historical perspective until the archaeological surge of the 1700s and 1800s. The Hittites were known from the Bible, but people thought of them as just a Canaanite tribe because we didn't know much about the children of Heth, the Hittites, until we began to dig up their settlements and we began to find references to the Hittites among the Mesopotamians and among the Egyptians. And we find out that more than 1,000 years after this time, the Hittites are going to be a vast empire that has significant battles with Egypt and gives Egypt a run for its money. But at this point, the Hittites are just this far-flung little tribe that lives up above the region that we would think of as southern Turkey or southeastern Turkey by the Taurus Mountains. But he doesn't conquer the Hittites. How might history have been different if he had? That's a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to have an answer. And for what it's worth, I don't have one either. Okay, so Ramush. Let's see. We have until 11:10. That's correct. Okay, so we are way good on time. Ramush, the son of Sargon of Akkad, who reigned only 9 years. We have seen that he was a campaigner, but he was also a great builder. He was known to have done great infrastructure building projects within the city of Akkad and in the conquered places. He installed roadways, and he was a great temple builder. He would build the holy places, and he would expand them, and he would beautify them. Ramush didn't reign very long, but it is known from the ash heaps of history where we found the broken pottery that he built things and he was remembered more for his building than for his military conquests. Ramush was despised by his people, though. Not just the conquered peoples, but the people of Akkad didn't like him. The Akkadians found something unsavory about him. He was not the popular ruler that his father had been or that his brother would be after him. He was hated. His nobles didn't even like him. And especially his family had a disdain for him. I suspect that there may be a couple of factors in this reputation. One is, remember, his older brother was passed over for Ramush, and it was his older brother who took the throne after he died. So I suspect it may be that, number one, he was probably disliked and despised because he was seen as a usurper, right? Protogenesis, right? The firstborn rules because he's the protogenitor. He has the right to rule. Except that didn't really exist yet, because the whole concept of dynastic kingship was still very new, at least in the post-flood world, certainly in Mesopotamia. So while it's possible that his big brother thought he should have been the king, it's not necessarily the case that all the people of the city would have felt that way. The nobles seem to reject Ramush, but we're not really sure why. But I wonder how much of this actually happened, and how much of it is the way history was retold after his death by his big brother. There is a victory stela of Ramush over the city of Lagash, and it still exists, but it's broken in pieces. This is what it looks like. As you can see, we don't even have the whole thing. 9 years into his reign, he suffered the most natural of causes of death for an emperor: assassination by his own courtiers. His own court assassinated him. Could be worse. If he were Roman, it probably would have been his personal guard. But it is interesting that you have a kingdom as stable and secure and growing and healthy as Sargon's. 56 years Sargon built that empire, and within 9 years his successor is murdered by his own court because the empire is failing. But it doesn't appear to be failing, right? I mean, this guy managed to do all these things. He faced rebellions and he quelled them. He continued the campaigns in the Northwest and he built things. So what was the problem? Well, I'm going to play historical detective and give you a guess. My guess is the only person who really hated Ramush was this guy, Meneshtu, the firstborn. Apparently he had a very strange face, or maybe that's a gas mask because he was the first one to use chemical warfare. But if you go back to our family tree, after Ramush reigned 9 years, Meneshtu reigned 15 years. During their reigns, Enheduanna still appears to be high priestess of sin at Ur, which makes sense. She's their sister, so it makes sense that she would live approximately the same lifespan as the two of them. All right, so let's talk about Meneshtu. Yeah, see, I think he raised taxes and took massive spoils from the military campaigns. But if you have, it's kind of like what happened in Rome, right? It started with the people of Rome paying taxes for the expenses of the government of the Senate, but the more they engaged in preemptive first strikes in order to prevent themselves from being attacked, the more the people of Rome got used to the idea that, hey, we don't have to pay taxes this year because we brought back all of that money and stuff from the campaign against Carthage, right? They got to the point where the people, instead of paying taxes, the people of Akkad might have been being supported by the emperor because they were bringing back slaves to do all the work, and they were bringing back riches that could have supplied the people with bread and meat. I don't know if that happened, by the way. I'm just saying that that's what happened in Rome, and it seems possible that something similar might have happened in Akkad. But it appears even the people of Akkad didn't like him, unless it's just a spin put on things by his brother. But it is possible that he raised taxes on the people of Akkad because greed is a common problem for emperors. Right. That's a good point. Manishtu, the firstborn, the third king of Akkad. We call him Manishtu because that was his name. He reigned 15 years. And this is the one who was the older brother of Ramush. And for some reason, Sargon passed over Manishtu. Sargon said, I think my younger son Ramush will make a better heir and better successor. He'll make a better emperor than Manishtu. So Manishtu did not become king until his brother was assassinated 9 years after the death of his father. He was posthumously deified by his son. That says defied. I think we can thank autocorrect for that. It should say deified, D-E-I-F-E-D. There should be, F-I-E-D. There should be another I before that F. Those kind of things stick out to me because I used to own a newspaper. Deified by his son. In other words, after he was dead, his son taught the people to worship him. They made statues of him, idols, that were used as good luck charms and enchantments. He was added to the pantheon. In his first year, he built a fortress. What do you think would have led to the need for Manishtu to build a fortress in the first year of his reign? Any thoughts? That's the most obvious one, right? His brother was assassinated. He may or may not have had anything to do with that, but he certainly knew it was possible for it to happen again, right? So he built a fortress. It's also possible that he might have been concerned that, this is the second regime change in less than a decade. He knew there were going to be revolts, right? There were going to be freedom fighters in the various city-states trying to get their autonomy back, their independence. But maybe it would even occur to one of these guys, Manishtu wasn't fit to be king. His father didn't even think so. And his brother's kingdom was short-lived because he made enemies even inside the court. This might be the perfect time not only to rebel, but to conquer Akkad. And so he built a fortress. Because when you build a fortress, then you can die slowly of hunger instead of quickly by sword. Sorry, a little bit of sarcasm there. He led a fleet down the Persian Gulf and defeated 32 kings. 32 kings. If you go to battle with 32 kings, what does a king bring with him to battle? Armies. Yeah. So 32 armies against the army of the Akkadians, the Akkadian horde, and he wins. He also sailed a fleet down the Tigris River that traded with 37 nations. Now, when I look at the Tigris River, there don't appear to me to be 37 city-states that are on the Tigris River. So what I'm guessing is, if you can see it well enough on your screen, this is the Tigris River. It goes up toward the Pontic Mountains and kind of ends right before it would reach the Euphrates. It doesn't quite get there. And so the Tigris goes very far north, and of course it it is fed by the Persian Gulf, or, depending on the time of year, could be fed by the mountains and empties into the Persian Gulf. But he, from Akkad, not far from the Tigris, takes the Tigris and sails upriver, and along the way trades, some very close, some further away, like the region of Subartu, but he trades with 37 nations, okay, 37 peoples. He made good use of the Tigris. It appears that trading up and down the Euphrates had already been somewhat common, but he was the first Akkadian emperor who really went far north on the Tigris River. It's easy to understand why his reign lasted 6 years longer than his brother's, right? In addition to defeating the 32 kings, he also found 37 trading partners. Now, typically, for a small nation state like Akkad, ruling primarily over Sumer and the area that we would think of as Ashur or Assyria, and expanding beyond that, kind of in an expanding, contracting manner, what would be the significance to the people of Akkad and the other Sumerian city-states of trading with 37 nations? What two things do you get because of trade? Go ahead, Kevin. Okay, so you gain access to foreign markets to have a supply of things that you either can't get locally or they're more expensive to make locally, right? Because of climate or what ores are available or what have you. Kevin, what would be the other thing? Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you're trading with people, they're less likely to go to war with you, right? Theoretically. I mean, that's the reason we have a trade relationship with China, right? Their economy depends on ours, so we hope they won't attack us. That was Nixon's whole plan when he opened up relations with China all the way back in the late 60s, early 70s. But what's that? Yes. So, but actually the one I was thinking of wasn't that one. Gilbert, aside from the political ramifications and the ability to buy stuff made somewhere else, what is the other advantage of opening up foreign markets? Okay. What about having a place to sell your stuff? In addition to buying stuff made far away, you can take the stuff they make here and you can sell it over there. All the way over there. So he created a new economy. Think about it. Because now you prepare goods, some are sold locally, but you start mass producing things so that you can, if you're the production side, you're the farmer or you're the blacksmith or you're the maker of the little god pots, you take those things and you mass produce them as many as you can, but maintaining a reasonable quality, and you sell them to the merchants. The merchants get on the ship with your stuff, They go upriver, they go to one of 37 ports, and they start selling your stuff. And when everybody buys that stuff, they make a profit. So they come back and they buy more of your stuff. And along the way, they also have picked up some stuff and they say, you can't get this here. You can't make this here, but you can buy it here because after I sold all your stuff, I brought back some stuff. So the merchants were pleased because he opened up an entire new industry of mercantilism or merchanting. But the people in Akkad, in Kish, in Uruk, the Sumerian people were thrilled because now they were able to export goods and import goods, and the trade economy makes everyone richer. Obviously, everyone except for the slaves. One thing you could count on ancient peoples all over the world to do is maintain that group of people who, weren't allowed to do anything but serve. I wish that were only an ancient thing and there was none of that in the societies on Earth today. But there is also another economic reality, though, that happens when you have this kind of economy. Maybe I'll even steal a line from a somewhat popular, though increasingly unpopular politician, and say that Manishtu had succeeded in creating an opportunity economy. You have the very rich and you have the very poor. What happens when you create a mercantile class and you create trade opportunities to open more markets? The answer is you create a middle class. Right? Right. But you've actually created, in between the nobles and the priests and the dirt poor, you've created a mercantile class, and you've created a production class, and you've created a middle class. I don't know how long that middle class lasted, but what Manishtu did was brilliant. And then he was also assassinated by his palace, one record says. Obviously, it doesn't mean that his castle killed him. His palace, meaning his own court, again, just like his younger brother. According to an old Babylonian omen, Manishtu was killed by his palace. I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know that there's a specific historical reason other than perhaps, toward the end of his reign, maybe things weren't quite as good. Maybe there was an economic downturn. Manishtu created a middle class, but what happens when you create a middle class? If they have a bad year, they blame the emperor, right? Sometimes that's reasonable and sometimes it's not. So he was also assassinated by his palace, according to an old Babylonian omen. If he was responsible for the death of his brother in some way, then it would appear that justice caught up with him. Any questions or comments about Manishtu before we move on to the second most famous king of Akkad? All right. Then we're going to come now to the grandson of Sargon the Great, the son of Manishtu, Naram Sin. Okay. Naram Sin. Robbie Mitchell writes he was the conqueror king. 56 years. Naram Sin was crowned emperor in 2254. Like his father and uncle before him, things got off to a rough start, and Naram Sin's reign began by putting down rebellions sparked by his father's death. Once this was done, however, Naram Sin's reign was marked by success after success. In fact, Naram Sin ruled for 36 years, according to Robbie. Wait a minute, I thought it was 56. And now you begin to see why the timelines of the ancient world don't line up. Because there are almost as many historical chronologies or timelines of the ancient world as there are ancient historians. Somewhere late in this class, toward the end of the spring, I'm going to actually give you my historical chronology of the ancient world. And you're going to see that it's probably, as reliable as anyone else's. And probably that doesn't mean much, right? That's not saying a lot. But did he reign for 56 years or 36 years? Well, the ancient records say 56 years, but modern historians say it's unlikely that Sargon and Naram Sin actually both ruled for 56 years. They're entitled to their opinion. I would like more evidence than unlikely. And he spent much of that time expanding the boundaries of the Akkadian Empire. He defeated the kingdom of Magan, modern-day Oman, in the United Arab Emirates, and he took on the northern hill tribes of the mountains of Zagros, Taurus, and Amanus, defeating them all and taking their lands. With these victories, he expanded his empire as far as the Mediterranean Sea and Armenia. So, let's go back to look at a map. So it appears that it was not until the reign of Naram Sin that these areas on the far-flung edges, like Cyprus and above the Taurus Mountains, actually became full tributary parts of the empire. They had been held for short periods of time. They had been raided. They had been looted. They were made to pay tribute. But under the reign of Naram Sin, they became his. Okay? And the beginning of his kingdom is right here in Akkad, which is just a few miles north of Babylon, right above Sippur. We think. Put a pin in we think, because we're going to come back to that at the end of class. All right. So, managed to? Naram Sin. Okay? Naram Sin is a legend. You will find that there is almost as much in the library of Ashurbanipal about Naram Sin as there is about his grandfather. It might be said that the people of Akkad kind of thought of him as the second coming of Sargon, in a sense, not a literal sense, but this was a guy who knew how to get things done. So much so that they even declared him a god before he died. Naram Sin was a living god. He was worshipped, not just adored. Naram-Sin apparently died of old age, and his son Shal-Kali-Shari reigned 25 years after him. And what might we know about Shar-Kali-Shari? Well, let's go back to Naram-Sin for a moment first. He's called the last great king of Akkad. According to the legends of the time, he reigned for 56 years. He signed a peace treaty and mutual defense agreement with the king of Elam. In other words, he said, you know what? Instead of me constantly trying to conquer you and you constantly trying to conquer me and us constantly wasting resources invading each other, let's just have a trade agreement. But as part of that trade agreement, let's agree no more aggression. I'm not going to attack you. You're not going to attack me. And by the way, king of Elam, let's also agree that my enemy is your enemy and your enemy is my enemy. If I have to go to war, you will provide troops and support. If you have to go to war, I will provide troops and support. In so many ways, this is advantageous to the people of Akkad, and far more so than it is to the Elamites, although it's good for them too. But go back to the map and look at where these places are, okay? So here's Elam on the southern eastern side of the Persian Gulf, right? And here you have this period or this area where the Akkadians are invading but have trouble holding, but they have enemies to the southeast of Elam, right? Well, Elam, by holding its border, there's Susa, the capital. Elam, by holding its border, provides a barrier for armies crossing to come into the area of Akkad. So this mutual non-aggression and mutual defense agreement actually shores up the border of somewhere that the Akkadians have conquered but have trouble holding, and where they have enemies. So what does he do? He says, Elam, let's make a deal. How about you guys defend my border for me? Right? Basically what he's saying is, we're going to be trade partners. And I'm going to protect you and you're going to protect me, and we're not going to hurt each other. But what that did is, you look at this area down here, basically, if these guys ever rebelled against Akkad, the Elamites are his army to repel the rebellion. On the other hand, the Elamites will be protected against the Marliski, the Kassites, and the Gutians. And they no longer have to worry about the Assyrians. So this is actually a really good deal, right? The Persians are getting fat, dumb, and happy with the with the Akkadians protecting them from the north, and the Akkadians have this conquered area being watched over by the king of Elam. It's a brilliant maneuver. Also, if you were going to come and attack the Sumer region from the Persian Gulf, whether you're, in Africa or you're in southern Asia, you're going to have to pass by the Elamites to get there. So now you can launch two navies to cut them off at the pass, as it were. So Naram Sin is a genius. All right. In an epic called The Curse of Agaday, he had angered the god Enlil, and and he was the god of air, wind, and storms, and the god withdrew his protection from Akkad and told the other gods to blackball the city of Akkad with no patronage. That's interesting. He had made himself a god, angered Enlil, and brought down the wrath of the gods upon him. And according to the curse of Agaday, this incident, whatever it was that angered the god, this incident was the reason for the fall of the Akkadian Empire. Even though the Akkadian Empire would not fall for half a century, according to the curse of Agaday, it fell because of the wickedness and immorality of Naram Sin. Which brings me to the question, could this guy be Nimrod? The name Nimrod means rebellion. Nimrod in the Bible rebelled against the God of heaven. The Sumerian and Babylonian retellings of these events of Naram Sin's life say that he was cursed because he essentially went to war with a god. So I told you there would be 4 different options for Nimrod presented in the class. This is number 3. Could Naram Sin be Nimrod? Any thoughts? No? Okay. Sharkali Shari, the son of Naram Sin, who reigned for 25 years. You won't believe this. You're going to find this hard to believe. But when Naram Sin died after 56 years of reign, the reign of his son began with uprisings in conquered areas. There were people who rebelled. People as far away as Syria, Cyprus, modern-day Turkey, or the southwest corner of it, the Indus Valley peoples, and even the Elamites, because that peace treaty, mutual trade agreement, mutual protection agreement, and anti-aggression agreement did not survive the death of Naram Sin. The Elamites, the predecessors to the Persians, or the Proto-Persians, if you will, almost immediately attacked. In addition to the Elamites, he also had to deal with the Amorites. The Amorites are a name we're more familiar with, right? Where have you heard the name Amorite before? From the Old Testament, right? it's interesting because the Amorites appear to be a nomadic people that travel far and get themselves into various places. Um, when you look at the people groups who were in ancient Canaan in the time of Abraham until the time of the Judges, you will actually find that there were Amorites living in Canaan in the days of Abraham. The Amorites were among the peoples who were at war with the Akkadian Empire during the reign of Shar-Kali Shari. But perhaps most notable are a people called the Gutians. Now, beings that you are all ancient Gutiologians, and you are abundantly familiar with the people known as the Gutians, I will only take a few minutes to talk about the Gutians. So the Gutians were a people that had been invaded by the Sumerites multiple times. And they invaded the people of Sumer at the end of the Akkadian Empire and began to go to war. What's interesting, if you look over here to where the Gutians live on the edge of the Akkadian Empire, the scary thing is for the Akkadians, the Gutians and Akkad are not that far apart. They do have the natural boundary of the Tigris River between them, but all they have to do is cross that river to go to war with each other. Okay? So the Gutians, they wanted to keep at bay. But after the death of Naram Sin's son has to deal with the Gutians and with the Elamites. Okay? Amora, in the land of what we would think of as ancient Canaan, is where the Amorites are. So he's trying to fight a war on multiple fronts. The Amorites, clear over here. The Elamites, all the way down here, southeast of the Persian Gulf. And he gets attacked from the northeast by the Gutians. So he's got to fight this way, and this way in an almost constant state of warfare during most of his kingdom reign. Now, what are the costs of war? What are the costs of war? People die and get injured, right? Go ahead. Lives and labor. Yeah, that's an obvious one. Dead men don't go home and work their farms. They don't go back to making things. They produce nothing because they're dead. Which comes to another one. If you've lost productivity because you've lost laborers, how does that affect your trade relationships? There's not as much stuff to trade as there used to be, right? In addition to that, armies tend to destroy things, right? They destroy granaries, they destroy businesses, they destroy homes, they destroy infrastructure. It's one of the ways that you wage war. And infrastructure is much easier to knock down than it is to build up, right? So that's expensive. It's time consuming. And in the meantime, you have loss of productivity again. But you know what else they do? They set fire to crops, right? And they kill farmers. Why? cut off your food supply. And this is a guy who's getting it from all sides. The Amorites are probably not crossing the Syrian desert. They're probably fighting all the way, probably to somewhere around here, as the Akkadians have to fight this fight to hold all of this against the Amorites. So they're not able to import anything from here with regularity because of the war. And closer to home, the Gutians and the Elamites are attacking. Now, the scary thing about the Elamites is they don't have to just come up by land. Remember, they have their own navy. They can bring their men to the through the Persian Gulf to Ur. They can go up the Tigris, and they can go up the Euphrates, and they can split off into each of these channels of the Euphrates, and they can essentially come up and lay waste to Sumer in a pincer maneuver from both sides. But the Gutians become the biggest problem, because they're the ones who are going to eventually sack the city and end the empire. But the offspring of Naram Sin, Shar Kali Shari, will not live to see that. Before he died, he rebuilt the temple of Enlil at Nippur. You may remember that Nippur is one of the closest neighboring cities to Akkad. So when you look at that map that we keep jumping back to, I should have put more copies of it in here. Here's Akkad, and Nippur is not, far away in the Taurus Mountains. Nippur is right here in the heart of Sumer. Okay? So remember, the kingdom started at Kish. Sargon became the king of Cush or Kish, and then built the city of Akkad. He has his daughter at Eridu, and his grandson also installs his daughter as a high priestess. And now in the days of Shar Kali Shari, we have a temple being built down here in Nippur, which, if you think about it, is almost dead center in the land of Sumer. Nippur represents the spiritual capital, in a sense, or at least the spiritual center of the primary Shinar Sumer region that the Akkadian Empire is built from. So he builds a temple. Okay. Shar Kali Shari. Will you stand still, please? It's just very sensitive today. The son of Naram Sin, who reigned for 25 years, his reign began with uprisings in conquered areas. He was constantly at war with the Elamites, the Amorites, and the Gutians. And he rebuilt the temple of Enlil at Nippur. That is the legacy of the son of Naram Sin. On the other hand, the empire got smaller during his reign. And of course, he is the father of Dudu, who reigned for 21 years. After the death of his father, 4 men tried to claim the throne, and a 3-year struggle ensued. Dudu finally got control of his empire and managed to hold it then for 21 years. And I think that's actually somewhat impressive, if I'm being honest, considering all the things that he was forced to deal with, if you will. Pretty impressive that he was able to hold it even that long. So, kudos to Sharkali Shari. He managed to do something pretty amazing, I think, if you're, if you're impressed by such things as holding on for dear life. Sometimes I think it can be, underrated to stay alive. What's interesting are, though, the people who were his predecessors, because Igigi held the area known as Sumer proper for less than a year. Following him, Nanum held the same region also for less than a year. Ilulu then held the same region for less than a year, leading to an almost 3-year period where Dudu was not recognized as the exclusive king of Akkad. 4 men, including himself, tried to claim the throne over a 3-year period until Dudu finally put down the rebels and was recognized as the king of Akkad. By that point, the Akkadian Empire was smaller, with the farthest parts of it now having declared themselves independence. It seems that he did not have enough resources to fight them all. So he restored order closest to home and never retook the outlying regions. So if you go back to what we were talking about in the reign of Sharkali Shari, his father, that constant warfare began to be too expensive in terms of men and money, and so they essentially pulled back the empire from its outlying regions to where basically they tried to return it to what you would think of as Acadia proper, from Assyria and Mari in the north down to Shinar in the south, not so much Elam or Ematbel, but it essentially just became this area closest to Akkad in the reign of Dudu. There is virtually no surviving evidence from the time of Dudu, but it's likely to have corresponded with the beginnings of the real Gutian invasion. Whereas the Gutians had been a thorn in the side of his grandfather and his father especially, they flat out invaded with the plan to take Akkad, beginning during the reign of Dudu. And Dudu only lasted for 21 years. Seems like a long time, but I'm sure it felt like a really long, long time to the people of Akkad. After Dudu comes the last king of Akkad, Shudarul, and he, as the last king of Akkad, ruled a much smaller empire. In fact, I would go so far as to say that during his reign, the Akkadian Empire really stopped being an empire. It was no longer a multinational kingdom, because he essentially was not even king of all of Shinar or Sumer any longer. And so we go back to our famous map, and he was only the king in Akkad, in Shunu, in uh, uh, Tuta, and in Sipur and Nippur. These areas didn't leave much for him to be the king of. So that means even down in Ur, Larta, Lapish, he did not have control of the Persian Gulf. He no longer had control of the ports. He no longer held Eridu, which was the heartbeat of the Sumerian religious world. He no longer held Uruk. He no longer held Umma. But he still held Kish. The city, Eridu is right down here. Can you guys see it on your screen? Right down there. Right below Ur, right below where it says Sumer on the map. Eridu. Okay? The first great city of the Sumerians, symbolically losing Eridu is essentially losing control of Shinar or Sumer. This is not an empire anymore. This is just a great kingdom. Okay? I did not mean to do that. I need to get my screen back. Hang on a second. If you go past the final slide too fast, it will literally cut off the PowerPoint presentation. You guys probably already knew that, but just thought I'd share that in case you didn't. Okay. Let's go ahead and switch that out so we can get the full screen effect. And there. Go live. Okay, that'll make it easier to see. All right, so going back down then to Dudu and Shudu rule. So he reigned over the last decade and a half, 15 years of the Akkadian Empire, but the artifacts from the time indicate that he only ruled over Kish, Tutub, Nippur, and Eshnunna. So primarily 4 major cities with it seems like to me, just from what the records say, some of those smaller villages around them were also part of the kingdom, but it was a much smaller kingdom. He was also a military leader and foreign minister as well. In other words, he began to work for other kings. Okay? Sargon had served in the court of King Ur-Zababa, and Shuduro seems to have played, though he was a king himself, played a military leadership position and foreign minister for the region of Sumer for other kings. So, kind of full circle. So then we come back to our map, and there it is. All that's left. Kish, Eshnanu, Titua, and Super. This is a very small area to rule over for the grandson of great-grandson of Naram-Sin. And you can see why Naram-Sin is called the last great emperor when you see what became of the kingdom once he was gone. Right? All right, guys. We got chapel in 6 minutes. Any questions before we go? He is coming up very soon because so what we're doing is we're doing Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia right now in the Bronze Age, and then we're going to come to Egypt in the Bronze Age and basically back up. So yeah, he is coming soon because we are very soon going to be getting to Egypt. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much. See you in chapel.